welcome to the third flipped lecture. Today we're going to be talking about the creation and development of penicillin.
Hello. Penicillin itself was made from a mould called Penicillin. The mould was first discovered in the early 19th century by John Sanderson, who found that very little grew near it. In the 1880s, Joseph Lister noted these observations and wrote to his brother saying that he intended to try penicillin on infected wounds. Lister successfully used penicillin to treat a young nurse who had an infected wound. However, he did not leave any notes, and the case was apparently closed after that. Several other scientists investigated the mould but were unable to produce it in sufficient quantities or discover a way of applying it to a patient. It was in the laboratory of St Mary's Hospital, London, in 1928 that Alexander Fleming rediscovered the properties of penicillin.
On investigation, he found that penicillin bacteria had got onto the dish, possibly blown in through an open window. The penicillin was killing the Staphylococcus. There were other versions of the story of how Fleming discovered penicillin. Indeed, Fleming's own versions varied. When he explained in 1945 how he grew the mould, it was a different explanation from his original report from a research paper in 1929. However, the important point is that Fleming observed the results and recognised their significance. The penicillin could be applied to or injected into areas with penicillin-sensitive microbes. However, Fleming did not have the facilities or the support to develop and test his idea that penicillin could fight infection.
How was penicillin developed? Well, it was the Second World War which finally brought about the successful development of penicillin. In the 1930s, two Oxford scientists, Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, became interested in Fleming's 1929 paper about penicillin. In 1939, they gathered together a skilled research team, including pathologists, chemists and biochemists. And 3 days after the outbreak of the Second World War, Florey asked the British government for money to fund the team's research into penicillin.
Stage 1. Growing the penicillin. The process devised by Chain to make penicillin was a combination of the latest freeze-drying technology and some much more traditional equipment. Thousands of milk bottles in which to grow the bacteria, milk churns, a dog bath and a hand pump. Slowly the team gathered a few grams of pure penicillin. Stage 2. Testing it on animals. There was just enough penicillin to try and experiment on 8 mice. They were all injected with dangerous microbes. 4 were given penicillin and 4 were not. 24 hours later, the mice who had not been injected were dead. The ones who had were fine. Stage 3. The human trial of penicillin. The team needed more penicillin for the first human trial than they had had for the mice. It was not until early 1941 that they had enough to test on a human patient.
Although this patient still died, the trial confirmed that penicillin was a powerful drug. Florey was sure that if enough had been available, the man would have lived. Production of penicillin remained painfully slow, but as new batches were produced, 2 more patients were successfully treated. A year later, in August 1942, Fleming himself used penicillin successfully to treat a friend who had meningitis.
It was clear that penicillin could be a very powerful treatment, if only it could be mass-produced. The growing casualties of the Second World War added urgency to this need. Florey knew that a massive amount of research and investment would be necessary to produce the thousands of doses that penicillin needed.
But it wasn't an easy road, and there were setbacks. Production in Britain was always going to be a problem because of the threat of German bombing. So in June 1941, Florey travelled to the USA to try to interest drug companies in developing penicillin. At that stage, the USA was still not involved in the war. There had been only 3 successful trials of penicillin. There was no proven method for speeding up production. However, in December 1941, the USA entered the war, and this completely changed the situation.
In 1942, the US government gave $80 million to 4 drug companies to find a way to mass-produce penicillin. In 1943, production began. The first use in war was the British Army in North Africa. By June 1944, there was enough penicillin to treat all the casualties suffered on D-Day. By 1945, the US Army was using 2 million doses a month. It is estimated that another 15% of wounded Allied soldiers would have died without penicillin to fight off their infection. Penicillin also roughly halved the average time that the wounded spent in hospital. Soon after the war, penicillin became available for civilian use. It was called an antibiotic.
The story of penicillin is a great one for showing different factors at work in providing and producing medical change. So you have chance from where Fleming discovered the mould in his laboratory. You have war, which really speeded up the need for penicillin to be developed. You have governments looking to back it with their money. You've got technology, okay, Florian Chain really using technology to help them. You've got scientific experiment, the testing on the mice. You've got industry, mass producing. You've got individuals working in teams, people such as Florian Chain and also Fleming. And then you have communications, where governments were discussing what they should do, particularly the US and the British during the war. But the final story of penicillin is about the individuals involved. Although there was some links between Florian Chain and Fleming, Florian Chain were very uncomfortable with the amount of credit that they thought Fleming got for his role. They saw him as the discoverer of penicillin, but they as the developers. Although all three of them gained the Nobel Prize, you can see here, it was Fleming that took much of the credit. And that was something that always really annoyed Florian Chain. That concludes our third Flip lecture. Make sure that you rewind, pause us, use us to get as much knowledge as you can. But also, please be aware you're going to be testing